The harvest this year has been bountiful.
We are indeed fortunate, praise be.
Morning ends today. We will be free.
They will find them soon. Even from where I sit now, hidden miles away in the chill of the Alabama woods, I can see it in my mind as clear as if I were standing in that grand dining room. The bodies scattered like broken dolls, the crystal glasses tipped on their sides, the river of spilled wine dark as drying blood. It is the morning of November 25th, 1854, and Magnolia Grove Plantation has finally learned what it feels like to be helpless. By now, the sun will just be pushing its way over the tree line, turning the frost on the cotton fields into a pale silver shimmer. The overseer's whistle will not blow. No one will ring the brass bell on the porch. The slaves will wait longer than usual, shifting from one foot to the other in the yard outside the quarters, wondering why the morning routine has not begun. Some will whisper about sickness. Others will glance at the big house, uneasy, sensing that something is wrong but not daring to speak the thought aloud. The house slaves will be the first to see it. Maybe Mary, or young Thomas, or Sarah with the crooked fingers from where they broke her hand and it healed wrong. One of them will tiptoe through the side door, expecting to be scolded for being late, expecting to find the master shouting orders and the mistress asking why her coffee is cold. Instead, they will find silence. The fire in the great room will be nothing but gray ash and embers. Wax from the candelabras will have run in thick rivers down the silver stems, hardening in white twisted shapes along the table. The air will still hold the faint smell of roasted meat and butter and nutmeg, the ghosts of last night's feast clinging stubbornly to the heavy curtains and polished wood. And then they will see the first body. I imagine Mary standing in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream when she sees Master Wallace slumped over the head of the table, his face twisted into a rictus of agony, eyes half open, as if he died in the middle of a word he never got to finish. His hand will still be wrapped around the stem of his crystal wine glass, fingers gone stiff and white. The glass will be cracked where it hit the table. The red wine beneath him will have dried into a dark halo around the base. She will think he is alone at first. One dead man, the master himself, and that alone would be enough to send terror through her bones. But then her eyes will travel farther down the table, and she will see more. Senator Crawford, the man who once delivered a speech in Montgomery saying slavery was the natural order ordained by God, will be sprawled across his chair at an angle, his chin tucked into the ruffles of his shirt, his lips tinged blue. His wife, the one who used to complain if a servant stood too close, will be lying on the carpet, her hands stretched out as if she had tried to crawl away from the pain that pinned her down. Across from them, Judge Morrison, whose signature had sent more than one runaway to the gallows, will be frozen in a half-collapsed position, his chair tipped back, his body caught between falling and sitting. His daughter will be near the fireplace, her fine silk dress torn where she clawed at herself in her final moments, hair loosened from its pins and spread like a dark halo around her head. There will be others. The Bogards, with their cotton empire and their cruel appetites, their sons who laughed at the whipping post. The Thorntons from Montgomery, whose money lived in banks and railroads and human bodies. Their faces will all bear the same expression: surprise, then fear, then a pain so deep it dragged them out of their chairs and onto the floor. Some will be curled in on themselves. Others will clutch at their stomachs. A few will have died reaching toward the doors or windows, as if they believed there was still somewhere left to run. Mary will not understand at first that they are all dead. She will look for movement, for a twitching hand, for the rise and fall of a chest. Maybe she will call out, her voice thin and trembling in that huge room. "Master? Master Wallace, sir?" No one will answer her. She will step farther in, her shoes sinking into the thick Persian carpet that cost more money than she will ever see in her life. She will smell the sour stink of vomit beneath the sweeter scent of last night's wine and roasted meats. Somewhere in the corner there will be a chamber pot overturned, its contents splashed in a desperate trail toward the door. She will recognize that smell too. Servants always do. She will see the overturned plates, The gravy hardened into a glossy skin, the stuffing left half-eaten on silver forks still resting on china. Bits of turkey will be scattered on the floor beside a shoe, a fan, a dropped handkerchief, a broken pearl necklace. Everything will tell the story of people who thought they had all the time in the world, suddenly yanked into eternity in the space of a few choking breaths. Then she will notice something else. There is no shouting, no moaning, no calls for water or doctors or help. The house is not a place of sickness. It is a place of aftermath. Whatever happened here happened in the long, dark hours between midnight and dawn, and it is finished now. The suffering is over. What remains is only the stillness that follows a storm. I can see it all in my mind because I created it. Not the silver or the rugs or the wine from France. I did not choose the guests or write the invitations. I did not order the string quartet or the flowers or the imported oysters. Those were Wallace's works, Wallace's dreams, Wallace's money, or rather the money he got from selling my sons. What I made was the silence. I am Dinina Washington, once the cook of Magnolia Grove Plantation. And this is the story of how I fed 30 of Alabama's most powerful people their last meal, watched them toast their own deaths with imported wine, and walked away into the November night with their screams still echoing down the hallway. They will search for me, of course. By midday, the news will spread from neighbor to neighbor, traveling along wagon roads and dirt paths, carried in the mouths of terrified servants and harried riders. Someone will hitch a horse and gallop toward town, toward the sheriff, toward the nearest doctor, though it will be far too late for any physician's skill to matter now. Word will reach Montgomery, then Mobile, and finally the governor himself. 31 dead at a single dinner. A massacre wrapped in silver and linen. They will not understand it at first. Men like Wallace never believe they can die at the hands of someone they consider beneath them. They will talk about bad oysters, about spoiled meat, about some plague carried from New Orleans or the Gulf. They will search for explanations that let them keep believing the world is as it has always been, with them at the top and us at the bottom, with the power to harm flowing in only one direction. But soon enough, they will count the bodies and the cups, the plates and the faces. They will notice one person missing, the cook, the woman who planned every course, the woman who knew every ingredient, every pot, every pan, every spice. The woman who had been there in the kitchen before dawn for 15 years, whose food they trusted more than they trusted their own wives' judgment. The woman whose sons were sold 2 weeks ago to fund this very dinner. My name will pass from mouth to mouth, soft and fearful at first, then angry, then full of a hatred they will pretend they did not have before. Dinina, diner. The cook. The poison woman. They will send riders. They will send dogs. The governor will sign his name to a paper promising more money for my capture than I have ever seen in one place. Men who never bothered to learn the names of the slaves on their own plantations will suddenly care very much about mine. But all of that is still ahead. Right now, somewhere not far from the big road, I am sitting on a flat rock outside the mouth of a cave, my back pressed against the damp stone, watching the pale November light creep through the trees. My fingers are stiff from the cold and from the long hours of work last night, ladling gravy and carving meat and carrying heavy platters until my arms ached. My clothes smell of smoke and fat and death. My hands also smell faintly of mushrooms. I rub my thumb against my forefinger and imagine I can still feel the powder there, fine as dust, clinging to my skin as I stirred it into the stuffing and sauces, measuring each pinch with a care I have never used even with the most delicate dessert. Enough to kill, not so much that it would reveal itself too soon. Enough to mimic the familiar rhythm of food sickness, not so much that it would be obvious as murder to stupid, arrogant men. I am still shaking, but not from regret. People will ask, this story ever reaches their ears in some far-off future, whether I was sorry for what I did, whether I felt any pity for the men and women who lay sprawled across their polished floors this morning, their power drained from them like wine spilling from broken glass. They will turn my act over and over in their minds, weighing it like a stone in their hands, trying to decide if it was justice or evil, necessary or monstrous. but I am not thinking of them. I am thinking of Samuel's face as they loaded him into the wagon, the way his mouth formed the words, "I love you, Mama," without sound as the wheels began to turn. I am thinking of Joseph's shoulders shaking, his eyes wide and hollow, his wrists bound in iron for the first time. I am thinking of how Wallace told me about their sale as if he were discussing the price of flour. The world will call what I did a massacre. I call it an answer. The cold air bites at my throat when I breathe. I pull my cloak tighter around my shoulders and listen to the small sounds of the forest. A bird cutting through the branches, the distant rush of water from a creek swollen by last week's rain, the quiet crackle of frost breaking under some animal's foot. Out here, the world is indifferent to human power. Trees do not bow to senators. Rivers do not change course for planters. Mushrooms do not care if the liver they destroy belongs to a rich man or a poor one. I did not create the cruelty that led to this morning. Men like Wallace did that long before I was born. Long before my grandmother was dragged across the ocean in chains. The system they built was already full of poison. All I did was give it a taste of itself. This is where my story truly begins. Not with the sale of my sons, not with the mushrooms in the swamp, not with the first spoonful of stuffing on a polished plate, but with this morning, with the bodies cooling in Magnolia Grove, and the knowledge settling into my bones that I have done what I set out to do. I have killed 31 people, and I am still alive. For now. The kitchen at Magnolia Grove was my kingdom, though it was a kingdom made of smoke, heat, and chains. From before dawn until long after the lamps had been snuffed in the big house, I ruled that room the way other women might rule a household or a nation, through quiet control, through knowing everything that passed beneath my roof. I knew the creak of every floorboard, the groan of the iron hinges, the smell of each herb as it dried above the hearth. I knew which of the house slaves could be trusted to carry a message, and which ones would whisper to the overseer if they thought it might buy them mercy. I knew which days Master Wallace's moods would swing from charm to cruelty, and how to read the tension in his wife's voice before one of her headaches began. I learned these things because I had to. Knowledge was armor, and it was the only kind allowed to someone like me. My grandmother Celia had told me that once, when I was a girl still learning to balance a pot over a fire without burning the stew. "They can chain your body, child," she said, her voice rough as tree bark, "but not your mind. The ones who survive are the ones who learn when to speak and when to listen, the ones who remember." Magnolia Grove was a sprawling thing, a mansion dressed in white columns and arrogance, surrounded by miles of cotton fields that rolled out to the horizon like a sea. The house itself was 2 stories tall, its windows shuttered against both summer heat and the eyes of the people who worked its soil. Inside, every inch was built to remind you who owned the air you breathed. Portraits of dead men in powdered wigs glared from the walls. Rugs from Persia swallowed footsteps. Chandeliers of cut glass turned candlelight into trembling gold. I knew that house better than anyone alive, because I moved through every corner of it, unseen but indispensable. In the mornings, before the world woke, the kitchen glowed with the dim orange of the hearth fire. The smell of bread dough rising mixed with the salt of the smoked pork hanging in the larder. I would move through the space like a ghost, stirring pots, chopping vegetables, setting the rhythm of the day before the first rooster crowed. By the time the family stirred, breakfast would already be laid out. Biscuits light as air, eggs fried in butter, ham glazed with molasses, coffee brewed so strong it could wake the dead. Sometimes I caught the reflection of my own face in the polished copper pot's dark eyes, skin gone leathery from years of firelight, a streak of gray in the hair that refused to stay tied. I was not beautiful, not anymore, but I had presence. The younger slaves looked to me as something between a teacher and a warning. I had survived long enough to become necessary, which was as close to power as anyone like me could hope to come. There was a rhythm to plantation life, cruel and predictable. The field hands rose before dawn, their bodies bending under sacks of cotton before the mist burned off the fields. The overseer rode the rows on horseback, his whip coiled at his side like a second spine. By noon, the air shimmered with heat, and the cries of the men and women out there blurred into the hum of cicadas. Inside, the house slaves moved like clockwork, polishing silver, scrubbing floors, carrying trays up and down the grand staircase. And through it all, the kitchen kept beating like a heart. Master Wallace liked to say that the kitchen was the engine of civilization. He meant it as a compliment to himself, not to me. In his mind, it was his plantation, his wealth, his genius that made Magnolia Grove run. But I knew better. The truth was simpler and far less noble. The kitchen fed the people who beat the others. It kept them strong enough to keep the machine turning. And that made me dangerous. I had learned early that there were two kinds of power in a place like this. The kind you showed and the kind you hid. The first could get you killed. The second might keep you alive. I hid mine behind a mask of obedience, behind the yes sirs and no ma'ams that came as easily to my tongue as breathing. I nodded when they spoke, laughed when they expected it, and lowered my eyes when their tempers rose. But behind that mask, I listened. I remembered. People spoke freely around servants, especially ones they thought too ignorant to understand. I learned about debts and affairs, about which guests carried pistols and which carried secrets. I knew whose plantation was failing, whose sons gambled, whose wives drank laudanum to sleep. I even knew about the whispers of secession that began to circulate among the planters long before the war ever came. They believed themselves untouchable, eternal. They never imagined that the woman seasoning their soup knew more about them than they knew about each other. When the house quieted at night, after the candles were extinguished and the music faded, I would sit by the back door of the kitchen with a cup of chicory coffee and think of my grandmother. Celia had come from Africa long before I was born, stolen as a child and brought to Carolina, where she learned to survive by learning everything she could. She had been a healer, a conjure woman. White folks called her witch, though they came to her secretly when their babies fell ill or their crops failed. From her, I inherited not just recipes but rituals, knowledge of herbs that soothed fever and herbs that stopped the heart, roots that could draw love or hatred, leaves that could heal or destroy. Every plant has two faces, she would say, pointing at a stalk of foxglove or a sprig of parsley, one for life and one for death. The difference is only in the hand that uses it. That knowledge lived in me like an ember, banked and waiting. For most of my life, I used it only to heal. When the field hands came in with backs split open by the overseer's lash, I made poultices from comfrey and plantain. When the children coughed through the winter, I boiled pine needles and honey. The whites never asked what was in the medicines I made, only whether they worked, and I made sure they always did. They liked to think of their slaves as dumb, but they loved our cures when their own doctors failed. There were moments of quiet cruelty that etched themselves into my memory more deeply than the lash ever could. The day Mrs. Wallace made me scrub the kitchen floor twice because a single drop of stew had splashed onto her silk hem. The night she hosted a supper for the local ladies and made me stand in the corner for 2 hours, motionless, holding a tray of sweet cakes as they laughed and gossiped about who was pregnant and who was bankrupt. The morning she told me, almost kindly, that her husband had taken a fancy to me once, years ago, and that she'd forgiven me for it as if I'd had any say in the matter. Cruelty was the language of Magnolia Grove, spoken in soft tones and polite phrases. You learned to hear it the way you heard thunder in the distance, something that was always coming, even on clear days. Still, there were small mercies, too. The laughter of the younger slaves when I smuggled them a piece of sweet bread from the kitchen. The smell of rain on hot earth after a storm. The nights when I sat by the window of my cabin and watched fireflies rise over the fields, remembering a world I had never seen but that my grandmother swore still existed somewhere. For years I believed that if I kept my head down, if I was useful, if I followed every rule, I could protect my family. Samuel and Joseph were the proof of that belief. My boys were bright, careful, quick to learn. I taught them to read the language of people the way I read the language of herbs, to know when to step forward and when to disappear. I told myself that my obedience would buy them safety. That was the lie I fed myself every day. The lie that made the years bearable. The kitchen became my church and my prison both. Its walls knew every prayer I whispered under my breath. Let them live. Let me see them grown. I asked for nothing else. I gave everything I had to that house, to those meals, to the illusion that skill could buy mercy. And perhaps it would have, if mercy had been something men like Wallace understood. But that illusion shattered the morning he came to me with his grand announcement. Until then, I believed the kitchen could save us, that if I worked hard enough, pleased them deeply enough, I might shield my sons from the whip and the trader's wagon. I believed my labor could hold back the world. I was wrong. Still, on that morning before the storm broke, Magnolia Grove moved with its usual rhythm. The sun came up pink and pale through the mist. The bell rang. The house stirred. I served breakfast as I always did. Hot biscuits, ham, coffee, grits smooth as cream. Wallace praised the meal, patted his stomach, and spoke of his plans for the evening. I nodded in all the right places, smiling just enough to make him believe I was listening. Inside, though, something in me had already begun to crack. If anyone had looked closely that day, they might have seen the change, a different stillness in my movements, a shadow behind my eyes. But no one did. They saw only what they expected to see. A loyal servant, a steady hand, a woman who existed to make their world comfortable. The truth was that I had already begun to imagine another kind of meal, one that would feed justice instead of hunger. I didn't know yet what form it would take, but I knew this. The kitchen that had kept me alive would one day set me free. The morning he told me, the air in the kitchen was so still that even the fire seemed to burn without sound. The frost had not yet lifted from the window panes, and the breath of the house slaves hung in small white clouds as we moved through our chores. I was kneading bread dough, the rhythm steady, the smell of yeast and smoke wrapping around me like a familiar shawl. Outside, the first gray light of November crept through the trees, turning the world pale and brittle. I remember thinking how quiet it was, how the wind that usually rattled the shutters had gone still. It was the kind of silence that warns you, the kind that settles before something terrible happens. Then I heard his boots. Master Wallace always walked with purpose, fast, hard, as if he believed the ground existed only to bear his weight. When those footsteps echoed down the hall toward the kitchen, everyone froze. The young girls who were shelling peas at the table straightened in their seats. The boy by the hearth held his breath, wooden spoon mid-stir. I wiped my hands on my apron and stood waiting, the dough rising in its bowl beside me like something alive. He entered the room with a brightness that didn't belong to morning. His face was flushed, his eyes glittering with excitement the way they always did when he thought himself clever. "Dina," he said, he never could get my name right. No matter how many years I'd been under his roof, "I have wonderful news." I bowed my head slightly, keeping my eyes on the floor. "Yes, sir?" He began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of his steps. "We're going to host the most magnificent Thanksgiving celebration Alabama has ever seen. A true testament to the greatness of Magnolia Grove. 30 of the most influential people in the state will dine right here at my table, senators, judges, merchants. Even the governor's cousin has agreed to come." He paused, waiting for admiration, for some flicker of awe. I gave him what he wanted, a polite nod, nothing more. "It will be a feast unlike any other," he continued. "Oysters from Mobile, turtle soup, beef from the finest cattle in Montgomery County, quail, turkey, pecan pie, French wine." His voice carried the fever of ambition, the kind that burns hotter than fire. "Do you understand, Dina? This will put Magnolia Grove on the map. Every man worth knowing will be talking about me before the year is out." "Yes, sir," I said. My hands itched to return to the dough, to the work that kept my thoughts quiet. But I kept them folded in front of me, waiting for the real reason he had come. Men like Wallace never entered the kitchen just to share their dreams. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. "Of course," he said, "a dinner of this scale requires resources, fine ingredients, new linens, extra hands." He smiled then, that sharp, satisfied smile that made my stomach knot. "But I've already solved the problem. Money will not be an issue." I forced my voice to stay calm. "That's good to hear, sir." He took a step closer. Yes, he said, his tone almost playful. I've sold Samuel and Joseph to a trader from Louisiana. He's coming tomorrow morning. They'll bring $800 each, enough to fund the entire event, and more. For a moment, I did not understand the words. They floated in the air like smoke, shapeless, unreal. Sold, trader, Louisiana. My mind tried to fit them together and failed. I must have blinked, because when I opened my eyes again, he was still smiling. Sir? I whispered. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that grated like metal scraping metal. Don't look so surprised, Dina. You knew it might happen one day. Boys that strong and clever fetch a good price. They'll make fine workers in the sugar country. I felt the world tilt. The kitchen swam in front of me, the fire, the bowl of dough, the faces of the others who pretended not to listen but heard every word. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. My boys, I said, my voice barely more than breath. Your boys, he repeated, mocking me. That property. Don't forget that. I stared at him, at the man who had eaten food I cooked for 15 years, who had called me into his study to pour his brandy, who had once bragged to his guests that his cook's biscuits were worth her weight in gold. And now, with the same casualness he used to order more salt for the larder, he was selling my sons. They're good workers, I said quietly. Strong. They know the land. They're worth more to you here than to a trader. He waved his hand as though brushing away a fly. They're worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for them. And this trader pays well. I need that money, Dina. This dinner will be the making of me. You should be proud. Your boys are helping elevate Magnolia Grove. Proud. The word cut deeper than any whip. He went on talking about the guests, the wine, the menu, but his voice had turned into a dull roar in my ears. My sons. Samuel, 16. Joseph, 14. The only reason I had survived the past 15 years. I saw their faces in the steam rising from the pots, in the reflection of the knives. I saw them laughing as children, chasing each other through the yard. I saw the way Samuel's hand rested protectively on his brother's shoulder whenever the overseer passed too close. They were my reason, my heart, my proof that some part of me still belonged to myself, and in a single sentence, he had taken them from me. When he finally stopped speaking, I realized I had not moved. My hands were clenched so tightly that my nails had drawn blood from my palms. Please, sir, I said, the words trembling on my tongue. Don't do this. I'll work harder. He cut me off with a wave. Enough. The decision is made. The trader will arrive at sunrise. They'll be gone by mid-morning. You'll have plenty of time to plan your menu after that. I wanted to scream, to strike him, to throw the pot of boiling coffee in his face. But I didn't. I stood still, my heart pounding so hard. I could feel it in my fingertips. He was watching me, waiting for the outburst, hungry for it. He liked breaking people. It reminded him he could, so I gave him nothing. I swallowed the scream, the grief, the fury, and forced my face into calm. Yes, sir, I said. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. Good. I knew you'd understand. You're sensible, Dina. That's why I trust you. Now, about the dinner, 7 courses, each one better than the last. I want the guests to talk about it for years. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Oh, and make sure the bread is perfect. You know how Judge Morrison loves your bread. He chuckled at his own joke and was gone. The door swung shut behind him, and the kitchen came back to life. The others began moving again, stirring pots, chopping onions, pretending they hadn't heard. But I could feel their eyes on me, sympathetic, fearful, waiting to see if I would crumble. Didn't. I walked to the sink, washed the blood from my hands, and wiped them dry. Then I picked up the dough and began kneading again. Press, fold, turn. Press, fold, turn. The rhythm steadied me. Each push of my palms drove the panic deeper until it became something colder, something sharper. When the bread was ready, I set it aside to rise and turn toward the window. Outside, the sky had gone pale blue. The fields stretched wide and empty, the cotton long since harvested, the earth bare. Somewhere out there, my boys were still asleep in the cabin we shared, dreaming of another ordinary day. They didn't yet know they would wake to find their world gone. I stood there a long time, watching the light shift, until the smell of burning caught my attention, the edges of the bread starting to blacken in the oven. I pulled it out and set it on the table. The crust cracked beneath my fingers, hot and fragrant. It was the best loaf I had ever made. I broke off a small piece and placed it in my mouth. The taste was bitter. That night I lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind claw at the shutters. I could hear my boys breathing softly in the next room. I tried to memorize the sound. I knew that by this time tomorrow, silence would take its place. And when the silence came, when I stood by the window the next morning and watched the trader's wagon roll away with them chained in the back, something inside me died and something else was born. I had spent 15 years believing obedience could save us, but obedience had only ever fed the beast. I understood that now. Wallace thought he owned my body, my skills, even my grief. But there was one thing he could not own: what I would do with what I knew. I watched the wagon until it vanished down the road, and then I went back to the kitchen. I lit the fire, took down my grandmother's old herb jar, and stared at the label written in her faded hand. He wanted a memorable feast. I decided I would give him one. The day my boys were taken, the sky over Magnolia Grove turned the color of iron. Clouds pressed low and heavy, as if the heavens themselves meant to crush the earth. I watched the wagon roll down the oak-lined drive until it was no more than a blur between the trees, the rattle of chains fading into the hum of locusts. When the last sound died, the world went strangely quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that follows a scream you can't hear. I went back to the kitchen because I had nowhere else to go. The fire still glowed, the air still smelled of bread, but the place that had always steadied me felt hollow now. Every pot, every knife, every spice jar looked like a stranger. The world had shifted a fraction of an inch, and nothing sat where it used to. I wiped the table, folded the towels, set the kettle on the hook, because movement was the only thing that kept me upright. But my mind was somewhere else out on that road, following the wagon into the wet distance, counting the miles between a mother and her children. That evening I lit the lamp early and sat at the scarred wooden table. The light trembled across the walls, and my shadow bent over the jars that lined the shelves. Celia's handwriting still marked the old paper labels, faded but legible: Angelica, Sassafras, Mandrake. My grandmother's voice came back to me, soft and certain, the way it had sounded in the Carolina woods when I was small. Everything that lives can heal you or kill you, child. The choice lies in the hand that gathers it. She would crouch beside me, her skirts damp with dew, pointing to each leaf. This one draws out fever. This one calls sleep. This one never touch unless you mean to see the end of something. I had never touched that one, until now. After sunset, I wrapped myself in my cloak, slipped through the servant's door, and crossed the yard. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and wet soil. A dog barked somewhere near the quarters, then fell silent. Beyond the last line of cabins, the land dropped into a tangle of cypress and water oak, where mist lay over the ground like breath. The swamp was alive with the sounds of frogs and the slow drip of water. It had always frightened me as a girl, that place. Too many whispers, too many things that watched from the dark, but tonight it felt like kin. The swamp knew about secrets. I followed the narrow path Celia had shown me years ago, a ribbon of mud winding through the trees. Spanish moss brushed my shoulders like fingers. Every few yards I stopped to listen. Sure, I heard footsteps behind me, but it was only the echo of my own fear. I carried a small basket, a knife, and a prayer. The moon had not yet risen, and the darkness was thick enough to drink. When I reached the clearing, I knew it by heart even after so many years. An ancient oak stood in the center, its roots knotted like veins across the earth. Around its base, pale shapes glimmered faintly in the half-light, mushrooms white, perfect, and deadly. Celia had called them the sleepers. The whites called them death caps. She had told me they were beautiful because God wanted to test whether people could tell the difference between grace and danger. I knelt and touched one with the tip of my knife. The cap was smooth, cool, innocent. I thought of Samuel's laughter, of Joseph's careful hands tying bundles of herbs for me. I thought of Wallace's voice calling them property. And something inside me hardened into purpose. I cut the first stem close to the ground, laid it gently in the basket, then another and another, until the ring around the tree was broken. The smell rising from them was faintly sweet, almost pleasant. Death rarely smells like what it is. By the time I finished, my knees were soaked, my fingers numb from cold. I whispered a few words Celia had taught me, a prayer, or maybe a warning. May the earth take what it gives. May justice grow where mercy will not. Then I turned back toward the plantation, carrying my basket close to my chest, as if it held my children instead of their vengeance. The path home seemed longer. Every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. I imagined the overseer's dogs catching my scent, Wallace standing on the porch with a lantern, calling for me to explain where I'd been. But the night kept my secret. When I reached the back door, the moon was just beginning to rise, silvering the yard. I slipped inside and barred the door behind me. In the kitchen, I spread the mushrooms on a clean cloth. Their pale caps gleamed in the lamplight like coins. I studied them the way a jeweler studies gems, searching for flaws. Celia's lessons came back with startling clarity. Slice thin, dry slow, grind fine. I moved as she had taught me, steady and precise. The sound of the knife cutting through flesh was soft, almost tender. I laid each piece on the rack above the hearth, where the low heat would draw out the moisture without burning the poison away. The smell that rose was faintly earthy, nothing that would draw suspicion. I worked until my eyes burned from the smoke. When the last piece was dry, I ground them to powder with the mortar and pestle my grandmother had carried across 3 plantations. The sound of stone against stone filled the room, rhythmic and deliberate. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the horizon, turning the windows pale gray. By the time the rooster crowed, I had a small jar of fine white dust no bigger than a handful, but strong enough to fell an army. I sealed it tight, wrapped it in cloth, and hid it behind the sacks of flour. I stared at that jar for a long time. My hands trembled, but not from fear. For the first time in my life, I held power that no whip, no master, no law could take from me. It was a terrible power, born of pain, but it was mine. The day passed in a blur of routine. Breakfast, orders, scoldings. Mrs. Wallace complained that her tea was too strong. The overseer shouted about the new field hands. A child spilled milk on the porch and was whipped for it. The same old cruelty continued, as if the world had not changed, as if my boys were not gone, as if there were not death drying above their heads. I smiled when expected, bowed when required, and kept my secret. That night I dreamt of Celia. She stood at the edge of the swamp, her hair bound in a white cloth, her eyes bright as coals. "You understand now," she said. "Healing and harm are twins. You can't have one without the other." I wanted to tell her I didn't seek harm, only balance, but she only smiled and faded into the mist. When I woke, the taste of swamp water was on my tongue. In the following days, I tested the powder. Not enough to kill, just enough to know its strength. A few grains in a bowl of milk left for the rats. By morning they lay still beside the hearth. The power worked as promised. Slow, silent, certain. I cleaned the evidence carefully and said nothing. Each task of the day became part of a larger ritual of preparation. I ordered ingredients from Mobile and New Orleans. Expensive delicacies Wallace would never question because they fed his vanity. I planned menus, counted dishes, assigned chores. On the surface, I was the same efficient cook he had always relied upon. Beneath, I was measuring out judgment in ounces and teaspoons. Once, Sarah the maid with the crooked fingers caught me staring into the fire too long. "You all right, Miss Dinah?" she whispered. I nodded. "Just tired." She studied me a moment, then said softly, Sometimes tired turns to something else if you don't rest. I almost told her everything, but the words lodged in my throat. Better she not know. Knowledge like mine was a curse that spread. When Wallace finally announced the date of his grand dinner Thanksgiving Day, 2 weeks away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The decision had already been made. All that remained was execution. The kitchen would once again be my kingdom, but this time I would not use it to feed the hunger of masters. I would use it to starve the monster that had devoured my life. That night I wrote a few lines on a scrap of paper and tucked it behind the jar of poison. For Samuel and Joseph. For Celia. For every mother who has buried her children in silence. Then I blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the soft crackle of the dying fire. The house above me slept soundly. The master dreamed of his glory, the mistress of her guests, the world of its own righteousness. Only the kitchen was awake, filled with the faint scent of dried mushrooms and the knowledge that, for the first time, the power in this house had shifted. The kitchen had always served them. Now, it would serve me. The first time I met Dr. Alistair Beaumont, I thought he had walked into the wrong house by mistake. No white man I had ever seen move the way he did without that heavy swagger of ownership, without the sharp, restless watchfulness that came from constantly guarding power. He stepped into my kitchen like a man entering a church, hat in his hands, eyes soft but alert, shoulders slightly bent, as though the air itself carried weight. It was 6 months before the Thanksgiving feast, on a day when the heat lay over Magnolia Grove like a wet blanket. I had been cutting a thick slab of salt pork, tired and careless, and the knife slipped. The blade bit deep into the fleshy part of my palm. Blood spilled onto the table, bright and sudden. I wrapped my hand in my apron and kept working. There was always more to do, but one of the house girls saw the way my fingers shook and ran to tell Mrs. Wallace. The mistress came sweeping in, perfume fighting with the smell of onions and grease. She took one look at my hand, wrinkled her nose, and called for the overseer. "We can't have her bleeding all over the food," she said, as if I were a spigot. Left running. "Fetch Dr. Beaumont. My husband is not paying for an invalid in the kitchen." The name meant nothing to me then. Another white man, I thought. Another one who would talk over me like I was furniture. I sat on a stool by the window, pressing cloth tightly against my palm, feeling the warm seep of blood. The pain was sharp, but I'd known worse. Scars cross your body long before they cross your soul. He arrived 20 minutes later, the hinges of the back door sighing as he stepped inside. I remember the smell of him first. Clean linen, saddle soap, a faint trace of tobacco. Not the sour mix of brandy and sweat that clung to most of the men who visited Magnolia Grove. "Good afternoon," he said to me, not to the mistress hovering behind him. His voice was low, steady, with a northern edge that softened the long vowels of Alabama. "I was told someone's injured their hand?" I looked up, startled, and met his eyes. They were a clear, thoughtful gray, the color of river water on a cloudy day. Most white men look through you, not at you. His gaze settled on my face as though I were a person in front of him, not a problem to be solved or a tool to be fixed. "Yes," I said slowly. "It's just a cut." He moved closer and held out his hand. "May I?" That one word may hit me harder than the knife had. He was asking permission. From me, a slave woman with blood on her apron. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. I nodded, unable to find my voice, and handed him the cloth. Blood had soaked through, sticky and dark. He unwrapped it carefully, examining the wound with a focus that felt almost tender. "Deep," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "But clean. You've done well to keep the pressure on. We'll need stitches." "Is that really necessary?" Mrs. Wallace sniffed behind him. "It's just her hand, as long as she can hold a spoon." He turned his head just enough to address her, polite, but firm. "If it doesn't heal properly, she won't be able to grip a knife or lift heavy pots. You'll lose your cook for weeks, maybe permanently. I recommend we do this right." The mistress pressed her lips together, displeased but silent. He turned back to me. "This will hurt," he said quietly, "but I'll be as quick as I can. I'll explain each step as I go." No one had ever explained anything to me when they caused me pain. Whips did not give warnings. Neither did hands or orders. Yet here he was, unfolding a small leather kit on my kitchen table, talking me through the boiling of the needle, the cleaning of the wound, with spirits that burned like liquid fire. I clenched my teeth but did not cry out. I would not give the mistress that satisfaction. "Breathe," he reminded me. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." His fingers were steady on my wrist, anchoring me. "You've borne worse, I can tell. But there's no shame in pain." Shame in pain. The words were so foreign I almost laughed. When he was finished stitching, he wrapped my hand in clean bandages and tied them off with a neat knot. "You'll need to keep it dry as much as possible," he said. "I can come back in a few days to check it." "Is that really?" Mrs. Wallace began, but he cut her off with a gentle firmness. "It's necessary if you want her back to full strength, ma'am." He looked at me then directly and said, "Your hands are valuable, Mrs. Washington. Take care with them." Mrs. Washington. The name hung in the air like incense. I hadn't been Mrs. anything in my entire life. To the white folks, I had always been just Dina, or girl, or that woman in the kitchen, or worse. But he said it without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to address me with respect. Something in my chest shifted, fragile as glass. "Thank you, doctor," I managed. He smiled a small, tired smile that softened the hard lines at the corners of his mouth. "Just doing my work." He came back 3 days later, as promised, checked the stitches, praised the way the wound was closing, left me with a small vial of salve and instructions on how to apply it. A week after that, he returned to treat one of the children in the quarters who'd taken ill with fever. Then again for a field hand whose leg had been torn open by a rusted plow. Each time, he moved through Magnolia Grove like a man walking through a graveyard, somber, respectful, fully aware that the ground beneath his feet covered bones. He spoke to us, not at us, and listened to our answers. He didn't flinch from our stories. When Sarah told him about the time the overseer broke her fingers for dropping a tray, his jaw tightened, but he did not indulge in useless sympathy. Instead, he taught her simple ways to stretch the stiff joints, to ease the pain. When old Isaac complained of a cough that wouldn't leave, the doctor gave him herbs and instructions, then sat with him a while, listening to the wheeze of each breath as if it mattered. Word spread among us that there was one white man who looked you in the eye without malice, one who called you by your name, or sir, or ma'am, depending on your age. We didn't trust easily, but we noticed. Still, I reminded myself, he was white. He moved through a world built for him, paid by men like Wallace to keep their property in working order. Whatever kindness he showed lived inside a system that would always value our bodies as tools, not souls. I kept my distance, even as I watched him with a curiosity I wouldn't admit. Then, one afternoon in early November, I overheard his name in the wrong place. Wallace was in his study, door half open, discussing the guest list for his grand Thanksgiving dinner with a neighboring planter. I had been called in to refill their glasses, to stand quietly in a corner while they talked politics and profit over bourbon. "Beaumont, you say?" the neighbor asked. "Yes," Wallace replied, tapping ash from his cigar. "He's not one of us, but he's useful. Treated Crawford's wife last month when she took ill. And he's a good name to have at the table. Looks respectable to have a physician among all the cotton and cotton mouths." They both laughed at that, a rough, ugly sound. I nearly dropped the decanter. Doctor. Beaumont. At the table. At that table. The plan I had been building in my mind for days, the careful distribution of poison in the stuffing and sauces, the slow, patient justice I had carved from mushrooms and rage, suddenly had a crack running through it. One man among 30, and my certainty crumbled. That night I sat alone in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed, the lamp burning low. The jar of powdered mushrooms sat in front of me, its glass catching the light like an eye. I turned it slowly in my hands. 30 deaths, I had told myself. 30 architects of misery. 30 pillars of a system that had stolen my sons. 30 was a clean number, a righteous number. But now I saw another face in that count. Gray eyes, careful hands, a voice that called me Mrs. Washington. Was he guilty? Yes. And no. He was part of their world, paid by their coin, sheltered by their laws. He patched up the bodies that slavery broke so they could be worked again. Without men like him, more of us might have died quickly instead of slowly. But he treated us as people when he didn't have to. He risked the master's scorn by showing us courtesy. He worked long hours in the quarters with no profit in it for him, only sweat and the satisfaction of his oath. I could not decide, and the not knowing gnawed at me. I thought of Samuel and Joseph, jostled in some wagon in Louisiana, their wrists bleeding where the iron bit. I thought of all the white faces that had watched their sale with boredom or amusement. The ones who would be laughing at Wallace's table on Thanksgiving, praising the tenderness of the turkey while my boys bent their backs in a foreign field. Did one decent man among them cancel out the rottenness of the whole? Did his kindness excuse him from the justice I meant to serve? I did not sleep that night. I watched the shadows move across the floor, listened to the mice scratch behind the walls. Just before dawn, I made my decision, not a perfect one, not a holy one, but the only one I could live with. I would spare him if I could, not by abandoning my plan. That was no longer possible. The moment the trader's wagon disappeared, the path had been set, but I could carve out one small space within the storm. I could prepare a separate portion of each poisoned dish, clean and untouched, and see it placed in front of him alone. If chance or chaos changed things, I would accept that as part of the price. But I would not kill him blindly. In the days that followed, I built a second plan beneath the first. While I taught Mary how to skim fat from the broth, I measured out untainted stock into a separate pot. While I instructed Thomas on basting the beef, I set aside a cut that would never feel the touch of mushroom powder. While Wallace boasted to his guests about the magnificence of his coming feast, I quietly arranged the dance of plates and serving trays in my head, seeing exactly where Beaumont would sit, which path I would take to his chair, how I would swap bowls without attracting attention. It became a puzzle, terrible, intricate, almost elegant. Death in most dishes, life in a few. All of it carried on the backs of people the guests barely saw. On the morning I learned for certain that Dr. Beaumont had accepted the invitation. A strange relief settled over me. At least now the question had shape. It was no longer a shadow. I took the jar of poison from its hiding place and held it up to the light. "Not you," I murmured, thinking of his careful hands on my wounded palm. "If I can help it, not you." But even as I said it, I knew the truth Celia had whispered all those years ago. Once you call death to your table, you don't always get to choose which chairs it fills. Still, I had made my choice. In a world that had stolen nearly every choice from me, that mattered. When I blew out the lamp that night, the kitchen sank into darkness. Somewhere up in the big house, Wallace was dreaming of his greatness, counting alliances before they were forged. In the quarters, the people who'd seen too much loss already curled around their thin blankets and tried to forget the sound of wagons. Only I sat awake, listening to the hush between heartbeats, feeling the weight of the coming feast pressing down like a storm cloud. One good man at a table full of monsters. I would try to save him, and I would not regret destroying the rest. Thanksgiving morning broke sharp and bright, the kind of day that fools a man into believing the world is pure. Frost silvered the grass, the air smelled of smoke and oranges, and the sun rose over Magnolia Grove as though it had forgotten the wickedness that lived beneath its roofs. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching the light slide across the yard, feeling a calm so deep it frightened me. It wasn't peace. It was the stillness of a blade before it falls. The house had been humming since dawn. Servants hurried back and forth with buckets of water, baskets of vegetables, rolls of linen. The maids were polishing silver until their fingers bled. Even the field hands had been brought up to rake the drive and hang wreaths of pine along the porch. Every detail had to shine for Master Wallace's great performance. I moved through it all like a ghost, issuing orders in a low voice, checking each dish twice, sometimes 3 times, tasting for balance not of flavor but of fate. I had spent 2 weeks weaving the meal like a tapestry, 7 courses of beauty and death, Oysters Rockefeller, rich and clean, untouched. Turtle soup thickened with cream. Roasted quail with wild rice. Then the fourth and fifth courses, the ones that would end them, beef tenderloin with mushroom sauce and the turkey with cornbread stuffing. The death caps had been ground to dust and sifted into those dishes in quantities so precise that not even God could have separated one grain from another. For Dr. Beaumont, I had prepared a mirror version of each course, identical in look and scent, but pure. His portions sat covered and labeled in the pantry, hidden in plain sight among the others. As the morning deepened, the smell of roasting meat filled the air, fat crackling, herbs singing in butter, sugar melting into syrup for pies. Mary looked up from the stove and smiled nervously. "It's a fine day, Miss Dina," she said. "The master say he never seen the kitchen so busy." "Fine day," I agreed, stirring the gravy that could have killed a regiment. "Let's make sure it stays fine until supper." I kept my movements measured. No trembling hands, no quick breaths. Fear would spoil the broth faster than sour milk. Each motion was deliberate, ritualized. When I reached for the jar of mushroom powder, I felt as if I were touching scripture. I thought of Samuel's narrow shoulders, Joseph's careful eyes. Every spoonful I folded into the sauce was a prayer spoken in their names. By noon, the dining room upstairs gleamed. The long table stretched beneath its chandelier like a river of white linen and silver. The good china from England gleamed with painted gold leaves. The crystal flutes waited for wine imported from France, and the centerpiece roses and holly spilled over the sides like blood and snow. Wallace inspected everything with the pride of a king surveying his crown jewels. "Well done, Dina," he said, giving me a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Tonight we show Alabama what hospitality means." "Yes, sir," I said. Hospitality. The word tasted like ashes. At 4 o'clock, the first carriages rolled up the drive. Wheels crunched on gravel, laughter drifted through the air like perfume. I watched from the kitchen window as men in wool coats and women in silks climbed down, their jewels catching the sunlight. They looked like saints in stained glass, beautiful, brittle, and false. Among them I saw the gray coat of Dr. Beaumont. My heart jolted once, hard enough to make me grip the window frame. He looked out of place amid the peacocks, moving with that same quiet dignity he always carried. He nodded politely to the butler and disappeared into the glow of the parlor. As the clock struck 7, the dinner bell rang, and the guests filed into the grand room. I stood just beyond the doorway, half in shadow, watching them take their places. Wallace presided at the head, his face flushed with triumph. The candles burned steady, the air heavy with roasted meat and wine. My pulse beat in my ears like a drum. "Let us give thanks," Wallace announced. His voice carried the smug certainty of a man who believes himself blessed by Providence. "For family, for fortune, for the good order of our Southern way of life." The words made my throat tighten. Good order. Way of life. Those were the phrases they used to bury chains beneath prayer. When he lifted his glass, I gave the signal. The servants began the dance of plates. Oysters first, then soup. Each course passed from my hands to theirs, from theirs to the gleaming table. The guests praised the seasoning, the texture, the balance. I smiled when they smiled. My secret sat silent inside their bowls, waiting. The first 3 courses passed without incident. The laughter grew louder, the talk looser. Then came the 4th beef tenderloin with mushroom sauce. My hands were steady as I ladled it, but my heart was not. I had rehearsed the switch for days. One untainted plate set aside for the doctor. I marked it with the sprig of parsley placed just so, a trick invisible to anyone else. The servants carried the trays out. I stepped forward to follow, wiping my hands on my apron to keep them from shaking. Through the crack in the kitchen door, I saw Beaumont seated midway down the table, flanked by Mrs. Crawford and young Miss Morrison. His head was slightly bent, listening to Mrs. Crawford chatter about politics she did not understand. I watched her pale fingers toy with her wineglass. The servers moved in, placing plates before each guest. I leaned forward, tracking the parsley sprig. It landed in front of him perfect. I exhaled. When the guests cut into the beef, a murmur of approval rippled around the table. "Exquisite," said one. "A triumph." said another. Wallace preened. "Dina has outdone herself," he declared, and they all laughed, raising their forks in salute. No one noticed the quiet woman in the doorway who had stopped breathing altogether. For 20 minutes I waited, heart-hammering. Nothing happened. Of course, nothing when death moved slowly. I turned back to the kitchen, signaling the next course. The turkey, the true test. The birds had been roasted to perfection, their skins lacquered gold. The stuffing within shimmered with melted butter, fragrant with sage, and lethal with poison. I cut the special one for Beaumont first, carving careful slices, arranging them on the clean platter with a practiced grace. Then I filled the rest with the tainted dressing. Again, the parsley marker distinguished the safe plate. Again, I rehearsed the path in my mind. Left side of the table, second chair from the end. Simple, precise. The dining room erupted in applause when the turkeys were brought in, their scent filling every corner. Wallace stood to carve the first slice, basking in admiration. "A feast fit for kings," he boasted. The plates went out, one by one. I watched each move, every turn of the wrist. When the tray reached Beaumont's end, I stepped forward myself, taking the plate with the parsley sprig. He looked up as I approached, eyes bright with recognition. "Mrs. Washington," he said softly, "you've outdone yourself already." I lowered the dish, forcing a smile. "Plenty more yet, sir." His voice warmed. "You'll have to share your secrets someday." "I keep them where they can't be stolen," I said. The words came out smoother than I felt. I turned before he could read the tension in my face and moved to the next guest. When I returned to the kitchen, I allowed myself one breath. It was done. The poison was in place, the innocent spared. I had carried justice to their table and life to one man who deserved it. Or so I thought. I was checking the sweet potato soufflé when Mary's voice came from the doorway, breathless. "Miss Dinah, Dr. Beaumont." He traded plates with the lady beside him, said she looked poorly and wasn't eating. The spoon fell from my hand, clattering against the stove. "What?" She said she had no appetite. He said it'd be a shame to waste good turkey. The room spun. For a moment I couldn't find air. All the careful hours, all the precision, undone by one gesture of kindness. I pressed my palms to the counter, forcing my mind to clear. There was no saving him now. If I ran in there, if I stopped the meal, the truth would unfold like a flag for everyone to see. 30 deaths could bring justice. 31 would bring chaos. And even then, would they let him live if they knew I'd tried to spare him? The decision made itself. I stayed where I was. I listened to the sound of laughter floating from the dining room, the clink of glasses, the rustle of silk, the living celebrating the seconds before they became the dead. By 10 o'clock, the feast was finished. The guests retired to the parlor for brandy, cigars, and gossip. I oversaw the cleanup in silence, my body moving on habit alone. I could feel the poison, working already the faint complaints of queasy stomachs, the coughs, the whispers that maybe the oysters had turned. Wallace laughed it off. "Too much indulgence," he said, slapping backs, pouring another drink. "We'll all sleep it off by morning." I knew better. The symptoms would begin in earnest within hours. Nausea, pain, the creeping failure of organs that no medicine could mend. By sunrise, Magnolia Grove would be quieter than it had ever been. Around midnight, the first scream tore through the house. I stood at the sink, hands in the wash water, and waited for the second. It came, then a third. Doors slammed. Footsteps thundered above. Mary crossed herself. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Mercy had her chance," I said. My voice did not sound like my own. Through the next hours, chaos reigned. Servants ran for buckets, towels, anything to clean the vomit and blood. Guests collapsed where they stood, clawing at their bellies, calling for doctors. And there was one doctor among them, poor Dr. Beaumont, trying desperately to save others even as the poison coiled inside him. I saw him once, near the foot of the stairs, helping a man to his feet, sweat shining on his brow. Our eyes met across the hall. He gave me a look of confusion, almost pity, before another wave of pain bent him double. I wanted to go to him, to confess, to explain, to beg him not to hate me in whatever place comes after this one. But I didn't move. I couldn't. The house was full of dying people, and I had no right to pick which one deserved comfort. When dawn came, the screaming stopped. 31 bodies lay where Joy had sat the night before. The light slanted through the broken shutters, touching their still faces with gold. I walked through the dining room, stepping carefully around the fallen crystal and spilled wine. Wallace sat at the head of the table, mouth open, eyes staring at something he'd never see. His fingers were locked around his glass, as though he still meant to toast his own ruin. At the far end, Dr. Beaumont lay slumped in his chair, peaceful now. I knelt beside him, touched his cold hand, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Then I rose, wiped the blood from the floor with a cloth, and began to pack my things. Night is a different thing in a house full of dying. It presses close, folds sound in on itself, and makes every small noise into a shout. At Magnolia Grove, the dark became a chorus of pain-low groans, the wet rattle of bile, footsteps thudding as men and women who had not yet learned how to plead for mercy found their voices and used them. I listened from the kitchen door, my palms cold against the frame, and felt each cry like a blow to the ribs. It began in fits, like a pattern in a storm. First one guessed. Some young man who had laughed too loud at his neighbor's joke ran to the chamber, hand to mouth, retching so hard he could hardly stand. Someone else cursed and demanded water. A woman moaned and clutched the nearest chair leg as if it were a mast in a sinking ship. Doctor. Beaumont moved through them like a lantern in fog. His hands were steady, his face set, the way a surgeon's does when he is trying to hold a life together with nothing but skill and will. He ordered them to drink, to be quiet, to breathe again. He called for warm cloths and spirits, and for a while the house believed him that perhaps this was a bad oyster, a transient illness, something to chastise the cook with and forget. But the poison did not listen to prayers. It had no respect for rank or decorum. It slipped from one guest to another like a thief through a parade. Nausea became cramps. Cramps became collapse. Collapse turned into the kind of silence that has teeth. I walked the threshold like a sentinel, unable to step into the room and unable to close my ears. Each time the door opened, a new tableau revealed itself. A man doubled over a wash basin, his hands clawing at the porcelain. A woman with powdered cheeks paling to a ghostly white. A child. No, not a child. A grown man sobbing like a boy while someone tried to pry his clenched fingers open. At some point, I stopped thinking in hours and started thinking in movements: fetch a cloth, bring more water, take his pulse, tilt his head. The servants ran as they had been trained, but each thing they did arrived too late. The house became a theater of well-meant gestures. Napkins to mouths that could no longer swallow, brandy handed to lips that could not taste it. I watched Dr. Beaumont and watched him fail. He worked as if the night were a wound he could stitch, but the wound closed faster than his hands could move. I remember a sound that would never leave me, the soft, awful thud of bodies falling onto carpet. The sound was ordinary furniture and flesh-meeting wood, yet that night it cut through me like a bell. Each thud carried with it a life folding in on itself. I catalogued them in my head without meaning to. Senator Crawford thud, Mrs. Crawford thud, Judge Morrison thud. The names were like stones. With each one I felt something inside me loosen, a knot that had tied me tight for years giving way. Not to relief, but to the heavy weight of responsibility. Around midnight, Dr. Beaumont caught my eye. He was moving between rooms, breath coming shallow and quick, his hands stained with sweat and other people's blood. For a moment, our eyes met across the swirl of chaos, a correspondence as quick and sharp as the flash of a blade. There was confusion there, then recognition. He looked at me with the same hesitancy he'd shown the day he stitched my hand, a question unspoken, an offering of pity and explanation. I wanted to go to him then, to tell him everything, to beg whatever forgiveness a man of his calling might offer. But the house needed me elsewhere. There were hands to bind and towels to supply, and people already slipping into that slow, ridiculous death that takes and then keeps taking. When I finally found him, it was because the parlor had fallen silent, an empty space amid the storm. The men who had been smoking their cigars lay collapsed in a circle, their limbs tangled as if they had fought one another in the dark. Beaumont sat with his back against a sofa, one hand pressed to his abdomen, his breath shallow. His face, which had always been composed, was pale and slack. Yet there was a certain calm about him that made my throat ache. He had tried everything he knew to do. He had bled himself dry of answers. "Doctor," I said, not sure if I expected a reply. He looked up at me and managed a small, tired smile. "Dinah," he said, as if it steadied him to speak my name. His fingers were cold when they found mine. "You should be somewhere else." "I have nowhere else to be," I told him. It was true in a way that felt like a confession. "I am sorry." He squeezed my hand with the strength that remained. "No apologies. Not now." He coughed, a wet sound that shook him. "We do what we can." "So much suffering," I whispered. I cannot remember if I meant the words for him or for the world. He tried to sit up, to reach for a flask someone had handed him, and the motion shredded him. I steadied him, supporting his shoulders as he tried to breathe through the pain. He closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them again, and in those gray pools I saw something like understanding. He did not accuse me. He did not call me monstrous. He looked at me with that same soft clarity and said, You have done what you thought right." My knees almost buckled. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him to go, leave, run, do anything. Instead, I knelt at his feet and looked up at him like a child asking for comfort. The world narrowed to the two of us, the dying, the dead, the stain of wine on the floor, and the small warmth of a man who had once seen me as a person. He asked in a voice so faint I feared I had imagined it. "Why?" I had rehearsed answers in the daylight, in the quiet hours while I ground mushroom to powder. Those rehearsed lines all sounded hollow now. I looked into his face, seeing the man who had tended to hands like mine, who had spoken to me as Mrs. Washington, who had risked the awkwardness of decency in a house that did not reward such things. I gathered myself into a single cold shape. "They sold my boys," I said. The words were small and true and terrible in their simplicity. "They sold Samuel and Joseph to raise money for this dinner." His face shifted, then pain, sorrow, a flash of something like shame. He reached for me and I felt his fingers brush my cheek. He began, and then the world bent. A new wave of pain overtook him, dragging him under. He tried to speak but could not. His eyes closed. I stayed with him as his breath grew shallow. In those last minutes I said the things I had not said before, not as explanation but as the offering of a soul. "You treated me like a person," I whispered. "You called me by my name." My voice broke on the word name, as if it were a treasure. "I did not want to hurt you." He smiled oddly, the kind of small smile that comes when someone sees a shape they recognize in a fog. "You," he managed, then coughed and closed his eyes. A single tear tracked down his cheek and left a light trail through the grime and sweat. "Tell them," he whispered, voice failing. "Tell them." He could not finish. I held his hand until it went limp in mine. Time unspooled. I felt, with a clarity that belonged only to those straddling grief and decision, that this moment would live in me forever. The feel of his skin, the smallness of his wrist, the way his breath left a room like a candle guttering. I bowed my head and prayed in the only language left to me, my own. By dawn, the house had changed its skin. The candles guttered uneasily, their wax cast into strange, dripping shapes that looked, in the weak light, like pale tongues. The parlor was a scatter of limp bodies and overturned chairs. The dining room was a landscape of plates and faces, forks still stuck in meats that would never be finished. The sun found the place with a hardness that made no promise of comfort. It poured through the shutters and touched the eyes of those who could no longer see. I walked through the rooms, stepping between the dead as if passing through a field of graves. Each face was a history. Laughter that had once been hearty and cruel. Skin that had blackened sun after sun at the edge of other people's fortunes. Hands that had signed deeds and orders and judgments over other lives. I felt nothing like triumph as I looked at them. If anything, there was a hollow, bone-deep weariness. The act of revenge did not leave a glow of righteousness. It left a hole that nothing could fill. In the parlor, Dr. Beaumont lay where he had fallen, a small cloth folded over his chest. His features were peaceful, oddly softened as if some merciful veil had smoothed his face. I sat beside him, and for a long time I did not move. I smoothed his hair from his forehead with a tenderness that did not care what the law or neighbors might say. "Forgive me," I whispered, though I was not sure whether I asked for his pardon or my own. I could have stayed there forever, the two of us locked in a moment no one could undo. But the world beyond the house was a place of hungry things. The rumor mill, the militia, the pockets of men who would not let this stand unanswered. I rose with the slow deliberation of someone who had made a bargain with the night. I left Dr. Beaumont where he lay and walked to the overseer's quarters with the steps of someone carrying a last will. There, in the drawer where the overseer kept his lists and his small iron key ring, I took the strongbox. It felt heavier than I expected, not because of the weight of the coins, but because of what those coins represented. 2 lives sold for a dinner, a sum that could buy freedom for some, the currency of a system that trafficked in people. I placed it with trembling hands into a coarse sack, gathered blankets and a little food, and for the first time since my sons were taken, I did not check the window to see if anyone watched me leave. Outside, the morning air bit at my cheeks. The estate stirred with distant sounds, men calling, a carriage starting, the first breath of panic as people who had thought themselves immortal realized they were not. I pulled my cloak tight and walked away, not as a thief but as someone reclaiming what had been taken. Behind me the house grew smaller and then was swallowed by the line of trees. Ahead the world was wild and indifferent. I had killed 31 people. I had taken the money meant to buy my sons. I had left Dr. Beaumont in a parlor he had tried to mend but could not save. In the hush after the dawn, I felt no triumph. What I felt was a searing iron clarity, that I had chosen a road that would not spare me from consequence, that every action rippled outward and struck others besides those who deserved it, and that I would walk it alone. As I disappeared into the wood, the plantation behind me full of voices and the beginning of a hunt, I folded the memory of Beaumont into my chest like a hot coal. It burned, but it gave light. The first step away from Magnolia Grove felt like stepping outside of a story that had been written for me. Each footfall took me beyond the lines they had drawn around my life, beyond kitchens and quarters, beyond the certainty that someone else would always decide my fate. I walked light and fast, my sack heavy with the strongbox and small supplies, the coins clinking like the pulse of a new life. I had taken $1,600 from Wallace's chest, the price of my sons, and more than enough, I thought, to buy the breath of freedom for a while. But money could not buy the silence of my conscience, nor the faces that crowded the corners of my mind. It could only open doors. The woods swallowed me quickly. For days I moved like a shadow, tucking myself into hollows, crawling beneath low branches, following game trails my grandmother had taught me to read like lines on a palm. I slept by the roots of trees, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and sawdust. My fingers ached from the strain of travel and the cold of an Alabama November that cut deeper than the wind. I kept the strongbox wrapped beneath hides and cloaks. At night, when I dared to count the coins by the light of a single ember, their faces would float up and accuse me. Samuel's broad grin, Joseph's shy half-smile, the way they used to chase each other between the barrels. I answered them only with resolve. I had done what I had to do. They found my trail fast. Men whose trade was tracking the lost and the hunted slave catchers with faces like weathered bark and eyes trained to find the faintest disturbance came from every direction. Word traveled like fire in dry grass. Neighbors sent riders, and the governor put his hand to the matter with the official coldness of power that must preserve itself. Rewards were posted, money and shame, for anyone who harbored the cook who had emptied a dining room of men who mattered. The land became a place of dogs and men, and the barking that followed me like thunder. But I had advantages they did not. Knowledge and memory. Celia had taught me more than which herbs cured fever. She had taught me how to move through the low country without leaving a trail, how to mask a scent, how to read the movements of the moon and the stars to orient myself when the road was hidden. She had shown me pits that swallowed a man's footprints, hidden caves beneath overhangs of stone, and the secret places where water gathered sweet and deep. I used all of it. Where the hunters left a clear path, I doubled back through tangles of willow and mud, rubbed my hands in red pepper and wild onions to confuse the hounds, and trailed my scent through poison ivy and bog to slow the horses. The dogs bayed and wheeled, their noses raw from the cruelty of hunting, but they could not follow the careful art of someone who had been shown how to scatter scent like a cloak. I learned quickly the cruelty of men in power. They lashed out at what they could find. Cabins near Magnolia Grove were torn apart. Men who had said nothing, who had only looked my way with a pitying glance, were dragged into the square and punished to make others tremble. Sometimes I encountered fugitives in the dark, other people who had slipped their chains for reasons both small and vast. They moved with the same haunted look in their eyes, the same careful whisper of breath. We shared food and news, barters of clothing and directions, and sometimes we parted without a word, because the longer we stayed together, the closer the hounds crept. Once, near a creek that cut a silver seam through a swamp, I ran into a patrol. The baying of dogs and the slap of boots on wet ground reached my ears before I saw them. Reflexively, I flattened myself into a bed of reeds as they passed within arm's reach, the wet blades brushing my face. A rider's boot splashed water inches from my cheek. I lay still until the last voice faded, until only the frog song remained. When at last I rose, my legs ached and my breath trembled with a fear that would not leave me. But I had eluded them. There were nights when I risked reaching a small settlement for supplies, trading a line of cooked meat or a tin pot for a meal. But always I paid with a part of myself. The looks men gave me in those places told me that my face had already become something that frightened them. Rumor and revenge had made me monstrous in the mouths of those who had never bothered to learn my name. Old women in one cabin spat and muttered that I had made men fall like fruit from a tree. A boy offered me a loaf for half the price and watched me with a hunger I did not trust. I kept my coin where I could hide it. I paid handsomely for a small map the size of a playing card, scratched by a merchant who hated planters and loved a secret coin. The map guided me northward into the less traveled hills. The hunt changed shape as it widened. Soldiers were sent, with stiff boots and flinty eyes, bearing orders to find the woman who had dared to undo their order. Bounty hunters came with whips strapped across their saddles and money in their belts. They left traces of cruelty in their wake, rounded up suspects, broken doors, burned fences. The law moved like a machine, efficient and blind. It did not care if the innocent suffered. Its job was to mend the tear in a world built on property and control. I kept moving. I learned which farms to avoid and which woods held food. I traded my coin for a small skiff and a pair of oars in a town that pretended not to watch me. Leave at dawn. I floated down black water for days, letting the current carry me when it liked, pulling the skiff into reeds when men passed. I ate small fish, crawled over fallen logs for berries, warmed myself on the coals of carefully buried fires. Once, by the light of a thin moon, I met a man who had helped a dozen runaways north in his younger years. He gave me a small patch of bread and a look that read equal parts pity and approval. "You did what you had to," he said without flourish. He did not ask for details. He knew they would kill him for harboring me, if anyone learned it. And I knew I could not repay him except with a nod. The winter came down hard. Snow did not fall in the lowlands that year the way it does in books. It came as a cold that rusted the trees and made rivers jagged with crusted ice. The wet traveled through clothes and bones alike. My cough began as a rasp at the back of my throat, a small annoyance that grew into a shadow. I wrapped myself in furs I bought with coin and in shawls stolen from a rich parson's trunk. Each step grew harder. Each breath cost me more. I found the cave by accident at first, a dark slit in the side of a mountain that lay like a sleeping giant. Its mouth was masked by brush and a fall of rocks, the kind of place no man would look twice at. Inside, a dry smell and the faint echo of dripping water greeted me. I crawled in and found more than shelter. Old lines cut into the stone where someone had sharpened tools once, a groove where water had flowed clean, and a small alcove that fit my body like a borrowed blanket. I made a nest of fallen leaves and moss, sealed the entrance with a web of branches, and slept with my hands under my cheek like a child waiting for dawn. It was here, in the hush of a cave that smelled of iron and the world before men, that I began to think clearly about what I had done and what I had become. For months my life had been the constant motion of running, of hiding, watching the horizon for betrayal. Out in the open, rumor and reward chased my steps. Inside the cave, the sound I heard was only my own breath and the slow drip of water. The ache in my chest had room to speak. The cough came harder now, sometimes in rattling fits that made me fear I would not wake. I boiled herbs Celia had named to draw moisture, and tried to eat when the hunger permitted. The coins sat in a wooden box I had carved from a broken crate. Sometimes I would count them and feel like a thief at his own work. Rumors of me grew while I hid. Word of the Thanksgiving killings spread like some dark gospel. People told my story in whispers and in shouting. They said I had escaped into the woods and become something uncanny, ghost, witch, folk hero, depending on who told the tale. Mothers in the quarters spoke of me with reverence. In town squares, men cursed me as a murderer. Someone wrote that I had made a last stand, that I lived like a queen among robbers. Each story added a new shape to me, and I could not control which one would outlast my bones. At night, by the low light of a single candle, I wrote down what I could remember. I folded the pages into a small bundle and hid them beneath a stone, because words outlive even the most careful manhunts. I wrote for myself, and for the memory of Samuel and Joseph. I wrote so that one day, when some child in a cabin asked about the woman who had walked away from Magnolia Grove, there would be more than rumor, there would be a voice. By spring, the chase had cooled into something else, an irritation, then a legend, then a cautionary tale whispered to children. Soldiers returned to their barracks one by one. Men with money lost interest as new distractions emerged. The law's appetite moved elsewhere. But the cost had been paid. The lives taken in the crackdown on enslaved communities owed their toll to the panic I had birthed. It was a price I did not measure lightly. In the cave, I learned to live with the knowledge that my freedom was bitter and never whole. I had left a house of silver and silk and carried with me a sack of coins and the echo of someone's last breath. The wilderness kept me honest. It asked of me only the skills my grandmother had taught me, and the stubbornness of a woman who refused to be owned. I do not know whether I will be remembered as villain or redeemer. Perhaps both. What I know is this: the cave held me through winter's teeth, and in its gray mouth I found a place to be just Dinina, no longer, only a cook, a slave, or a ghost in a story, while I gathered strength enough to put ink to paper and tell the tale on my own terms. Years have a way of losing their edges when you live alone. Time stops being something measured by bells or harvests. It becomes a slow river that moves the same each day, whether you stand in it or not. I learned that in the cave. The days bled into each other, sunlight slanting through cracks in the rock, the soft hiss of rain, the pulse of my own breathing. Sometimes, in the stillness, I could almost believe the world had forgotten me. But the world never truly forgets the things it fears. Word of me traveled farther than I ever walked. By the second spring, I began to hear snatches of my own name in the mouths of travelers who passed near the ridge where I hid. Once, while trading herbs and smoked meat to an old hunter, I heard him tell another that the poison cook still haunted the Alabama woods, a wraith with a knife in her apron and mushrooms in her hands. He said I could turn a man to stone with a glance. I laughed softly when I heard it, not from pride or scorn, but from the strange comfort of knowing that fear had kept them from coming closer. At night, I would sit by my small fire and write on scraps of parchment. The ink I made from soot and honey, the quills from wild turkeys. I wrote the truth as best I could remember it. How the feast smelled of time and sin. How Dr. Beaumont's hand felt in mine. How silence can taste like justice and regret at once. I wrote not for forgiveness but for understanding, as if setting the words down might unburden me from carrying them inside my chest. Each page began the same way. My name is Dinina Washington. It mattered that the name survived. It mattered that somewhere beyond the swamp and the search parties and the stories twisted by men who'd never cooked a meal in their lives, someone might one day read that name and see a woman instead of a monster. The seasons changed again. The first warmth of summer rolled across the forest, bringing with it the hum of insects and the scent of river lilies. My cough deepened that year. I could feel it gnawing at the corners of my lungs like a rat behind a wall. I knew what it meant. The long nights by the damp river had left their mark. I could no longer walk far without resting, and the thought of another winter in the cave filled me with dread. Still, I did not move. It had become the only place that belonged wholly to me. I spent those final months as I had spent the best years of my life, cooking. Not feasts, not vengeance, just small, careful meals cooked for the joy of warmth and the smell of something becoming itself over flame. Fish with wild onion, cornbread baked on hot stones, tea from roots that eased the ache in my chest. There was a holiness in that simplicity, a way of saying to the earth, I am still here, and I know your language. Sometimes I dreamed of Magnolia Grove. I would see the dining room bright again, candles flickering, silver shining, laughter swelling up like music. Then the dream would tilt, and all the light would drain away, leaving only the echo of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor. I'd wake with my hands trembling and the taste of ashes in my mouth. One morning, late in the summer of 1856, I saw smoke rising from the valley below. A campfire at first, I thought, but the column was too thick, too dark. Through the small gap in the trees, I could see the orange pulse of something burning a plantation house, though I could not tell whose. My heart thudded with a kind of terrible knowing. The war that had not yet come was already whispering its first promises. Men were growing restless. There would be more fires, more reckonings. I stayed hidden. I watched from my cave as men in gray and men in blue began to pass through the country, fighting battles I wanted no part of. Freedom, they said. Union, they said. Words that tasted fine in their mouths but had come too late for me. I had already fought my war, and its spoils were ash and silence. Then, one night, as thunder rolled low across the hills, a small sound reached me through the storm, a voice calling my name. Not a dream, not the whisper of wind, a human voice. Dinina? It was hoarse, cracked with disbelief, but it was real. I stumbled toward the mouth of the cave, heart hammering. A figure stood there in the rain, tall and thin, wearing the rags of travel. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through the downpour. Two ghosts waiting for the other to vanish. Samuel? I whispered. He stepped closer, the lightning flashing across his face, and I saw him older, scarred, but unmistakable. My boy, my firstborn. He looked at me with eyes that were both his and his father's, filled with too many years and not enough time. Behind him, another shadow moved Joseph, smaller but solid, carrying a sack over his shoulder. Ma, he said simply. The world tilted. I fell to my knees and they were there, arms around me, bodies trembling with the disbelief of reunion. I wept until my chest hurt, until I could taste salt and rain and redemption on my tongue. They told me pieces of their story. How they'd been sold to a sugar plantation near Baton Rouge, how they'd escaped during a hurricane that had flattened half the fields, how they'd traveled north with others who'd whispered about the cook of Magnolia, who'd brought the devil himself to dinner. They had not believed the stories until one day a trader's widow in Mobile told them of a woman who had vanished into the swamps with a strongbox and a curse. Then they knew. We've been looking for you ever since, Samuel said. Didn't care what we had to cross. I tried to speak, but could only shake my head, touching their faces as if to memorize them all over again. You're safe, I said at last. That's all that matters. They stayed with me in the cave for 3 days, feeding me, fixing my fire, repairing the shelter I had let crumble. They wanted to take me north, to freedom proper, to a world where no one owned anyone else. But I was too weak to travel far. My lungs had become traitors. Every breath scraped like sandpaper. I told them to go when I was gone to take the strongbox, the map, and the pages I had written. Make sure the truth goes farther than the lies, I said. Morning they left. I stood at the mouth of the cave and watched them disappear into the green tangle of the forest. They turned once, both of them, and lifted their hands in farewell. I did not wave back. Some goodbyes are meant to stay still, like prayers. When they were gone, I went back to my fire and took up my quill for the last time. My hand trembled as I wrote, but the words came clear. I have seen evil wear lace and kindness wear rags. I have learned that justice, when denied long enough, does not return gentle, it comes hungry. If my name is cursed, let it be cursed for the right reasons. If it is blessed, let the blessing fall on those who will never know my face. I sealed the papers in oilskin and placed them in the wooden box beside the remaining coins. Then I lay down with my back to the wall of the cave and listened to the rain. Each drop on the stone above me sounded like a heartbeat. When the last of the fire went out, I did not feel afraid. I felt only the vast stillness of the world, the way it holds you whether you deserve it or not. They found the cave years later, some said decades. A pair of hunters stumbled upon it while chasing a fox. Inside, they found bones wrapped in old linen, a rusted pot, and a small wooden box containing pages written in a woman's careful hand. No name was on the first sheet they read, only the words, "I served 30 souls their last supper, and in that night I served myself freedom." The story spread again, changing as all stories do. Some said she had been a witch, others an angel of vengeance, others merely a ghost who still cooked for the dead. But in the cabins of those who had once bent beneath the lash, the tale was told differently. There she was, a mother who had walked through fire and made the world take notice. Sometimes, when the wind passes through the pine hills of Alabama at night, the locals say it carries the smell of roast meat and thyme. They call it the cook's wind. It moves softly through the trees, not with malice, but with remembrance. And somewhere, in that space between story and truth, I am still there, Dinina Washington, the woman who learned too late that justice has many faces, and that one of them, at least, looked a little like her own.